Hello everyone, and welcome back to another card game tutorial video. In this video we will be working on adding the rest of the messages for our game. So if you remember, in the last video we linked two clients together, and then the only message we had set up is the message to join a room and the message that will change the opponent's hand. But where we left it off, we still have the opponent as a reflection of the player. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to stop the opponent object of being a reflection of the player and have it instead a reflection of the opponent. And in the next video we're going to be working on adding phases to our game. So if you're interested in that, be sure to subscribe. If you want to download these files and support this series, be sure to check out my Patreon linked in the description below. So what I want to do first is I want to take all of these message scripts and put them in the same group. And in the last video, what we did is we removed the code for this message that made the opponent object mirror the player object, and we instead added it all into a buffer and sent it to the server. So that's what we're going to do for the rest of these messages. So the next one we're going to work on is going to be field set. So what we want to do is comment out all of the old code. And then we want to add a new condition that says if the client object doesn't exist, return. And we're doing this so that we can use the same code even if we're on a single player game. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to packet all of the information we use here into a buffer and send it to the server. And whenever the server sends it to the opponent client, they will compute this code on their end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy over this code that we used to set up the previous message and paste it here. Now we're only going to need to add two variables to this buffer. So I'm going to remove this code here. And then I'm going to change the message ID to message field set, and then the two variables I want to send to this buffer are going to be argument 0 and argument 1. And then I'm going to send this off to the server. But now what we want to do is we want to add the code to compute when we receive this message. So if our opponent sends us this message, we want to make sure we utilize these variables properly, which is what this line of code does. So what we want to do is we want to go to our client handle message script, and we want to create a new case, and this is going to be for message field set. And what we want to do is with the opponent object, we want to compute this code. However, we still need to read in the card number and the position. So we're going to create local variables called position and card num. And we're going to read these values from the buffer. So I'm going to copy this over because I know my position variable is going to be size U8, and then I'm going to use a size of U32 for my card number. So then when I'm here setting up the local variable for my card number, I want to make sure this is U32. So now we have the condition for when the message is received. But now we need to go to our server and add a case for message field set. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy over this code here and the code to send the buffer packet and paste it inside of this case. Now we know we're going to use a buffer size of U8 and U32, and we want to read and we want to write to our buffer what we are reading. So this is all I have to do for this message. But I don't want to forget the message ID and the socket ID, because in all of my messages I'm going to first send the message ID, then the socket ID of the client that sent the message, followed by everything I want to pass, and then I'm going to send that message. But as you can see, we don't have this macro set up yet. So what we want to do is go to our server object in the create event, and these are all of the macros we have set up so far. But if I go back to my client object, I have all of these set up already. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy these over and paste them into our server object. So now if I go back, this macro has been successfully set up. But now let's test this to make sure this works. And I start my server, and then for my card game I set up an executable, I can then test to make sure that that message is successfully being read in. So now if I set a card down on the field, it will not reflect on this instance of the game. It should reflect on this instance of the game. So I'm going to set Squirtle down. As you can see, that's what it does. So now let's work on the other messages. And the first thing I want to do with the other messages is add the following lines of code just so the old script calls do not show up when we test this. So I'm going to go through all of the message scripts and comment out all of the older code. So now that I have this, let's go back to the next message. And again, I'm going to copy over the setup code from the previous message and paste it into the one I want to work on. So we're going to start at the beginning of the buffer. We're going to first write at the message ID, which is going to be message energy add. And then we're going to pass it two arguments, the position and the card number. So I'm going to write the next two arguments to the buffer, and then I'm going to send it off. So now I want to go back to my client handle message script and add a case for this message. So we're going to do case message energy add. And this code is going to be very similar to message field set. So we're just going to copy that over because it needs a position and a card number. But this code will be different. So we're going to close that one out and then go back to our message energy add. And then we're going to copy over this code. And then if we return to our client handled message, we can paste that here. So with the field card at position, we're going to add the card number to the next position in the pile. And before we test this, let's do one more message. So this next one will be message discard. So let's copy over the buffer initialization and paste it here. Again, we're going to change this message ID to message discard. And we are only going to write one thing to this buffer. And that's going to be the card number at argument 0. So remember, we're using a buffer size of U32 for our card numbers. You do not want to mess this up, because if you do, it'll be hard to troubleshoot this if you don't realize this mistake. So then what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our client handled message, and we're going to create a case for this message. Then we're going to copy this over, and I'm going to remove position because we're only passing one value through this message, which will be the card number. And then I'm going to remove the old code and add the code within this message, which is the next position in the discard will equal the card number we passed. But now that we've done this, we need to add these cases to the server end. So let's go back to the server. So the first case is going to be for message energy add. But if you recall, the buffer for field set and energy add are the exact same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this case and put it underneath this one, because the message ID is a variable as well as the socket ID, and then these will all be the same. So then I can go back here and change this case to be discard. And then I'm going to copy over this, because all of my messages will always start with the message ID and the socket ID. And then I'm going to write to this new buffer the next 32 bits of the buffer that we are reading from. And then I'm going to send it to the opponent for that client that sent this message. So now that I have these set up, I should be able to test these. So now I can test it. But if you remember, we removed all of the message code. So now this will no longer reflect anything on the player side, and will only reflect what's on the opponent's side. So we did two new messages. We did energy add and we did discard. So if I use this trainer card, it will get sent to the discard pile, and it should be reflected over here. As you can see, it is. The next thing I want to test is to make sure that the energy add works properly. So if I add an energy to Squirtle, you can see that it is reflected over here at the other instance of the game, as well as the discard message. So as you can see, the sending and receiving of buffers is quite easy, and you can see that it's going to follow this pattern with all of the other messages. So let's continue with the next two messages. So the next two we're going to do is going to be draw prize and prize select, just because I know they're going to be very similar. Again, I'm going to copy over the old buffer write code. I'm going to change the message to draw prize. And then I'm going to change the buffer size to U8 because we are only going to be passing it a number between 0 and 6. And then we want to send this buffer to the server. So I'm going to copy this over, and I'm going to go to the next one, which will be message prize select. Ooh, that's not the one I want. Instead of message prize select being the next one, we're going to do message remove prize, because that's the one that's going to be very similar to draw prize. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste the buffer code here, and I'm going to change the message ID to message remove prize. And then I'm going to write argument 0 to the buffer. So now that we have this, we can go to our client handled message script, and we can create a case for these two message IDs. So the first one will be message draw prize. And then for this code, I'm going to copy over this. Remove the code here, and I know I'm going to be passing it something with the size of U8, and I've called it position. So then I'm going to go back to my script message draw prize, and I'm going to copy this code over. And I've actually called the variable prize num. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste that here, but I don't need this object identifier because that's what this is. And I'm going to change this to be prize num. And that's all I will need for this message ID. But message remove prize is almost exactly the same. So I'm going to copy the whole thing over, change the message ID to remove prize. And instead of setting this value equal to 1, I'm going to set it equal to 0. So now we have the next two messages on the client end. So now let's go to the server end. But these are going to be very similar here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create two cases like I did for field set and energy add. But for message draw prize and message remove prize. I'm going to copy over this code here because it's going to be the same. We're going to start at the beginning. We're going to write the message ID to it, the socket ID, and then we're going to write to this send buffer the next 8 bytes of the buffer we're reading from. and then we're going to send it off to the opponent of the client that sent this message. So now that we have this, we can now test it. So I'm going to compile the server and create an executable for the card game. So I'm going to start the server, and you'll see that now the prize cards will be populated here, as you can see. But now I want to make sure that when I select one from my prize, that it's removed at the opponent end. So I'm going to, I can't test this yet because we don't have the send damage message yet. But we do have this code. I wonder if this will allow me. Nope. Okay, so what I need to do now is I can only test the remove prize message whenever I do the code for the message to send the damage to the opponent. So let's move on. So the next two messages we're going to do are message send damage and message prize select. So if we go to the send damage message, we see that we're going to send argument 0 and argument 1 to the buffer we're writing to. So I'm going to go to the message field set, and I'm going to copy this over so that I can then paste it here. So I'm going to change the message ID to send damage, and then I'm going to pass it two arguments, argument 1 and argument 0 and argument 1. Now these two arguments are going to be sized buffer U8 because damage is going to be a value between 0 and 100, and position is going to be a value between 0 and 6. So then I want to add this code in the client handle message script. So let's go there and add a new case. So I'm going to copy this over. Well, I'm going to copy over this one because it has two variables being read from the buffer. Both of them are going to be sized U8, and I'm going to remove this code. So now if we go back to send damage, this is what needs to be computed. So I'm going to paste this here. So we're passing it the position and the damage. But are we doing it in this order of position and then damage? So we're writing to the buffer. First, we're setting the damage at argument 0, then the position at argument 1. So when we read from the buffer, we want to read the damage first, then the position. So if I go back here, I'm actually going to want to swap these. Damage, position. So that's all we need to do for send damage. Now let's go to message prize select. So all this is doing is this is going to set a variable to true. So all we need to do for this message is we need to write only the message ID, and then we're going to send the buffer to the server. And this message is going to be prize select. If that's how you spell it. As you can see, we did not set up a macro for message prize select. So we're going to add that here. And we're going to set that to be 12. And then we're going to paste this over and add it to the server end. So now that we're here, if we go back to the prize select message, this is now red, and then we're just going to send this off to the server. But when we read it at the client end, what we're going to do is I'm going to copy this over, but since we don't need to read anything, we're going to remove all of this. And then we're going to go back to our prize select message and copy this code over, just so we can paste it here. But now that we have this, we're actually going to do this a little differently. This isn't going to be for the opponent. This is actually going to be for the player. So I'm going to put object player here, because the opponent object won't be able to select a card, because all of that is a representation of the client that sent this message. So this needs to be object player. So now we can test the client, but first we need to set up the server end. So if we go back here, message send damage, and message prize select. So again, send damage is going to be very similar to field set, in that it is sending, in that it is adding two values from the buffer we are reading to the buffer we are sending. So we're just going to paste that over, and it's going to be two values with the size of buffer U8, and then we're going to send it. Now, for the message prize select, that one's going to be a lot more simple, because all we're sending over is the message ID and the socket ID of the client that sent the message. And then we're going to send it off to the client. So now we can test these. So I'm going to start the server. And then I'm going to set 2 Pokemon down, because I'm going to test send damage. But as you can see, a Pokeball came in. I wonder if that will do it again. Strange. So we'll have to look into that later. But our send damage message works. But now let's see if our prize remove message works. So now I'm able to remove a prize card. And I drew War Turtle. As you can see, I drew a card at this end. And the prize card that I selected is now removed. But now let's see if I can destroy my own Pokemon if the opponent can then select a prize card. So now that this is here, now this opponent should be able to select a prize card. And I'm unable to do that because I never added the code that allowed the opponent to draw a prize card whenever they destroyed one of my Pokemon. So if I go to my field card object in the condition that a Pokemon card's health points is equal to their damage counters, down here where I added the comment allow opponent to take prize card, I'm going to add the script call script message draw prize. So now that I have that, I'll be able to test that next time we test the game. But now let's work on the last two messages. So the first one we're going to work on is going to be script message card position swap. So this message is going to pass two arguments to the server. So we're going to refer to a message that we've already created that draws two arguments to the buffer, and then we're going to paste that in here. We're going to change our message ID to message card position swap. And both of the buffer sizes will be U8, and then we'll send that off to the server. Now, when we receive it, we're going to compute all of this code. So now if we go to the client handle message script call and create a case for this message, now we're going to change the first with statement to be the object or the opponent object. And then we want to change our local variables to be the same as the variables we had in the script call. But since we've already initialized a local variable called position, we want to separate the position call in these lines of code to be specific to this opponent object. So for each position variable I'm calling, I'm going to add ID period in front of it, so that this code knows we want to use the position variable in the opponent object. Now that's all we'll have to do for this message. The last one we will do is script message evolve. And this message is going to be very similar to the prize select message. So we're just going to copy this over and paste it here. We're going to change the message ID to be message evolve. And then we're going to create a case for it in the client handle message script call. So I'm going to copy the code that's in the prize select message and paste it here. Except it's not going to have object player in the with condition. Instead, it's going to be the opponent object. And within this condition, I'm going to add the code that's within this script call. So what that's going to do is it's going to set the opponent object's evolve switch variable to be true, and then it's going to set the opponent's pokeball alarm for equal to 40. And that's all we'll need to do for this message. But now we need to add the cases for the server end. So we're going to add a case for message card position swap. And message evolve. So we know that the card position swap message will be very similar to this. So I'm going to copy this over and paste it here. And then I want to change this to U8 and this to U8. And for the message send damage, I also want this buffer size to match this buffer size. That's something I overlooked earlier in the video. But now if I go back here, the case for the card swap position message is complete. And now I need to do the same for message evolve. But we know that's going to be very similar to the prize select message. So I'm just going to add this case here. So we don't have to add too many lines of code. And then I'll remove this. But now that we have these, we have successfully added the code for all of the messages for our server and our client. So now let's test it. So now what we want to test is the ability to switch a Pokemon, evolve a Pokemon, and allow the opponent to draw a prize card if one of our cards have been destroyed. So we know that the evolve message will work if Squirtle evolves into Wartortle without the Pokeball retracting. So let's test that. As you can see, it did not retract. So if I use the Switch Trainer card and I drag Wartortle here, we'll see that the card switches at the other end, the Pokeball retracts, and goes back with the new Pokemon. So now let's try it with this one. And it does. But now let's see what happens when we destroy one of our own Pokemon. So now the opponent should be able to select one of their prize cards, which they were able to. And it updated on our end as well. So that's all I wanted to go over in this video. But as you can see, when I do an attack here, the Pokemon on this end does not mimic that attack. So that's something I'm going to need to go over in another video. But in the next video, we'll be adding phases to our game so that our game will begin to have the flow of a Pokemon card game. So if you're interested in that, be sure to hit the subscribe button. If you want to download these files and support the series, be sure to check out my Patreon linked in the description below. Until next time.